So Rick, tell me, how do you approach environmental storytelling?
I guess my approach for environmental storytelling has a lot thank for my theatre background. Because prior to being a game developer, I worked as a theatre director and creator for 12 years. So creating an image in front of a live audience really, I guess, honed in my skills for telling a story in the computer game through that environmental storytelling, basically creating that mise-en-scene. So I approach it in that way, and I approach basically everything that the player can see and hear that doesn't actually stop them playing. So
yeah, so you used to work as a theatre director, and it was all about trying to communicate what is happening, obviously with hardly any sets.
Yeah.
It was all about the imagination, but just putting in some prompts that's enough for the audience to take it in.
Yeah, I guess it's also one of the advantages of not being an overly wealthy theatre practitioner, in that we used to survive on Australia Council grants, so we had to make the best do with very small amounts of money. So anything that we created or put on stage had to be there for a very good reason. There was no money for just flashy props, just for the sake of it. Everything that was there for a reason. And I guess that discipline has come through to my game design. And the reasons I love environmental storytelling are basically, it allows the players to absorb the story without having to stop playing. A lot of players complain that the story bogs down the game. And environmental storytelling allows almost osmosis process to happen, where people are playing and they're just absorbing the story while they're playing. And it avoids us having to load a ton of exposition and explanations into dialogue, having windows of text to explain everything. And also, there's some players who just want to run through and just blow stuff up. And this way, it's, they're just absorbing the narrative. One of my students likes to call this narrative by stealth, because those players aren't realizing they're still taking in the story. So it's kind of a sneaky way. And having that story gives context to all their actions and their choices. So it actually enhances their experience, even though, they may say they hate narrative. But at the same time, if you create a rich narrative in your game, it allows those players that really dig narrative to just keep burrowing and reading more and more into the game. An example is Skyrim. I think all those books of lore that are on all those shelves. I'm a narrative person, and I have to admit I barely read those books. But I know people that read every single one, and there's actually PDFs out on the internet for those that want to read every word of those books. So they're the two extremes of players that you're trying to create a positive experience for. And environmental storytelling is just a really, I think, efficient and very immersive way to get narrative across to the player. And one of the reasons we can make it so rich is that we have so many channels at our disposal. There's the dialogue-based stuff, and I'm not talking about conversations with the player, but NPC, just background characters having conversations. And as a writer, narrative designer, I've discovered that's not only what is being said, but how it's being said, who's saying it, will all keep the player an idea of the world they're in and the sort of situation they're in. And then there's companion banter. For example, Fallout 4 has some classic companion banter. And there's actually a video on YouTube I came across the other day, and it has someone coming up to the robot races with every single companion that the player can have. And each of those companions has individual banter that tells you a lot about that world and what those particular companions are like, because they all react to the spectacle of these old rusty robots racing in completely different ways. I mean, for instance, one of the robots is outraged. Another character wants to bet on the robots, and all that sort of stuff helps you learn a bit more about the characters around you in the world. Dragon Age, the second game, I believe, had some great banter that had nothing to do with the player. The characters would actually have banter between each other, and some of it was fantastic. So that is dialogue, but it's not dialogue that's imposed upon the player. It's just happening. And then you've got basically events and actions that are happening in the background. You know, are there police, walking through buildings and checking people's ID? Are there fires? Are there riots? Are people happily shopping? Are people making their way to and from work in a busy urban environment? All those things happening in the background tell us a bit about that world.
Yeah, and as you say, they could just be taking it in, but you can also be playing with drawing their eye,
Exactly.
with
There's
activity.
all sorts of tricks.
Yeah.
To bring the eye or the ear to certain things. And then, of course, one of my favorites is in-game media. And that includes anything like TVs, radios, recorded messages, emails, even posters on walls, signs, advertising. And advertising, actually, I think is a great one, because it's not just advertising, but it's what's being advertised. Like, for example, Bioshock has all those weird skills and atoms that you could buy to burn people, to protect yourself, do all these weird and wonderful things. And that probably, it gives the idea that the world of Bioshock got pretty dangerous towards the end. The fact that these things are being advertised, and they're being advertised in a very sort of happy way that, it's almost as if they're selling washing machines or something, but they're selling weapons. So it tells you a bit about how warped that world became.
Well, and it's also, when we travel, it's quite clear when you go to a different place, or even just when you look through history and you see the advertising, advertising with it is imbued with an ideology, with a way of seeing the world, with it's all about some people, an agreed upon thing about this is what people want. Which is not true, like it's based on what people think is what they want, but it's not actually stuff that's really helpful to you as a human being to be a better human being. And so behind that is a whole lot of information about the way the society thinks.
Deus Ex Mankind Divided does it really, really, really well. They even had a trailer that was just an ad in that world, all about the augmentations and how you could become a superior human with these things. I think they do an excellent job in their sort of dystopian future that they have. Their advertising is so loaded with ideas and ideology that you just take in so much just from spotting an ad, and I think that's very efficient storytelling. And even in a more fantasy world, wanted posters, notices stuck on places, things scrawled on walls. It doesn't have to be cyberpunk or neon to have advertising. Even things like books are handy. And something that I think Fallout does really well is the packaging of the products, whether it's chocolates or their Nuka-Cola or even the vending machines, the sort of packaging around these consumable items is very tongue in cheek, but also tells you a bit about that very consumer atomic America that they're sort of taking the mickey out of. I think they're probably amongst the best for the wrappers and packaging. Architecture is fantastic. The design of the buildings, the materials they're made out of, what they're used for, and they might not be used for what they were originally built, which tells you something. The condition or state of the buildings. For example, one of my favorite examples I'll show later is Half-Life 2, the way they represent the buildings and the sort of detail of dirt and posters and things that they have on their buildings is very immersive and evocative. And I believe the lead environmental artist on that is now the lead environmental artist on Dishonored, and because it has that same sort of care and polish and detail to really be a evocative storytelling device. And of course, and then you've got your clothes, furniture, props. Are they plastic? Are they rich? Are they poor? All those sort of things will tell you about the character and about the world. And there's Half-Life 2. I know it's a very old game, 2004, but I believe the beginning intro section that lasts for about 2-3 minutes, depending on how much the player explores, is one of the best bits of environmental storytelling I've ever seen. From the player being on the train, that's the picture we have there, and there's the link from YouTube, and that'll be on Twitter if you want to have a look. I even 13 years later, I still refer to that beginning. From being on the train, you see people, they're spirited, dirty, grimy. There's not many people on the train. Everyone's wearing the same clothes. Everyone has numbers on their clothes. They're worried about being forcefully moved. And then you get off the train and you have this Big Brother screen just talking with this looping propaganda. And it can be heard wherever you are in the station. And there's also a hovering robot that takes your photo as you step off the train. And you see some brutality. There's some luggage and guards beating one of the passengers. And one of the interesting things about the station is that there's a lot more luggage than there is people. So it leaves you wondering what happened to the people that own that luggage. Because it's not exactly a bustling station, it's quite desolate. And there's another shot of the station. You have guards and those great posters with the character that's on the screen along there. And as you can see, it's pretty sort of a bit worn out, not exactly clean and pristine.
And this is where it's not just giving answers, but it's also posing questions, but questions that lead towards, you want the player to be thinking about certain things which are drawing them towards, the theme or objectives and things like that. Yeah.
And the great thing about this is unlike a lot of games, it doesn't stop the player or restrict the player. The player actually is free to move through the station as they want. And actually, the first time I played it, I came around here. What I didn't see was there's an alien up here, up the back here, actually collared and sweeping in front of a guard. So that's kind of a little treat if you happen to go off the beaten track and look over here. And there's another shot of the waiting room. Again, we have the posters. We have these long dead timetables from another period. There's only a few people, um, and it just, there's letter and papers everywhere, and it's not particularly bright. And then we come up to this section, which looks like something that you'd find on Manus or Nauru. Is this wire fencing and guards, and you have to walk through this winding maze of wire to get through to this checkpoint. And of course, there's Big Brother again with his looping propaganda. And eventually a guard demands basically that you follow him. And as you're walking through a corridor, you hear this person that had been on your train trying desperately to explain that he has a travel coupon just like everybody else. As you peek in, this guard comes along and slams the eye hole shut, which is very ominous. Then, of course, there's the room that you're led into, and pretty soon you realise this isn't a budget dentist, that you are in real trouble. And that's basically the first thing that you see as you led into the room: the spotlight, the blood, the chair. And I'd also like to just point out that there's no actual dialogue with the player. People mumble to themselves, or they make a comment to you as you're just walking past. Like there's one fellow who says, "Don't drink the water; it makes you forget things." There's a woman by the wire asking, "Were you the only people on that train?" And these kind of this desperate, something's very wrong. And I just think it's great. It tells you all about the world, this weird dystopian, alien, fascist world that you've stumbled into. And the ideas that it's getting across are actually quite complex, but it does it so easily. No one's had to explain anything to you, straight away, the world that you're in. And I think that's fantastic storytelling. And there, as I mentioned before, mise en scene, for people that come from screen backgrounds and theatre backgrounds, that's old news. But for game developers, for some, it may be not something that they often hear, but it's basically just the arrangement of everything that appears in the framing. It's everything the player hears and sees, and all of those things has the opportunity to contribute to the narrative. And I just want to show some more examples, quick screenshots. Here we have Metro 2033, and they do a great job of portraying the dark, underground, squalid existence that now the surviving Russians live in, because everyone lives in the underground subway, and actually various stations belong to various factions and ideologies, and they're all crowded, they're dirty, they're very noisy. You can hear people singing, selling their wares, children laughing, crying, pigs snorting in the background.
So these are, great examples of sort of recognizing as a player, seeing how this is happening, and obviously as a designer and narrative designer looking through and all the different ways that it communicated stuff. How do you, when you're working on a project, how do you sort of decide what to express in what way?
I guess it'll depend. It all depends on the game and the time that we have. Often I'll have a lot of chats with the artists, because they actually create a lot of these assets. I like to find out what's going to be in there anyway. And then I kind of sneak ideas into, hey, why don't we just put this on that sign? Or and I find artists love that stuff, to imbue the stuff they create with story. So it's often just, working closely with the art team and getting in early in the planning, so that you're not asking for new assets or new things after they've already created everything. But it becomes part of their process.
And do you think to yourself, okay, there's a whole lot of stuff that I need to communicate at this time, at this point in the level, whatever it is. And do you sort of have a thing in your head of like, okay, I want to try and get at least 70% communicated non-textually,
Yeah. I will basically try to get away with as much as I can.
Yeah.
And particularly in places where there's a lot of action, then I really try as hard as I can to basically cram narrative into everything that I can. Because it's not a time to stop and have a chat while you're being attacked by aliens, so I have to find a way to tell the story.
Yeah.
In places where it's a bit more quiet, you have that opportunity to have more dialogue. But often, for example, in Metro 2033, your time in these stations, you're not under attack and you're free to wander around. And they don't actually bog the player down with unnecessary chatting. The chats you have are very, I guess, realistic. It's talking to shopkeepers and guards and things, and you talk about things that they would talk about. So, the guard doesn't say, oh, by the way, things are pretty poor here and, blah, 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 blah. He'll answer whatever, immersive question that you have without having to explain all this stuff. So even in these quieter moments, I think it's still good to sort of front load as much narrative as possible through the environment. Because everything that the environment says is one less thing a character has to say.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you recommend for us as an activity?
Sorry?
Our activity prompt. What do you recommend that we do as a task?
Before I get to that, just some other classic examples. BioShock.
Just quickly, yep.
Yeah. And Half-Life 4. And just to prove that it doesn't have to be first-person perspective, there's Divinity Original Sin. And here is the activity. I basically call this showing is better than blah, 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 blah. Basically, write a scene, set the scene in a very specific style, setting, or period, because that will really help you figure out what can be seen in the scene, what sort of style. For example, detective noir, steampunk, fantasy, science fiction, for example, or very archetypal settings. And in the background, have 3 to 5 background conversations or comments. None of them more than 20 words, so no big monologues. And the aim of all these background comments or conversations is to help the player who is in disguise realize that an evil person, important, bad sort of character is dead and the player is being blamed for it. Rather than rejoicing at the death of this important bad person, the people are frightened that something bad is going to happen to other people or a group of people as a repercussion of the player's actions or alleged actions. So that's why you're in disguise. But you don't know that. You've killed this person, or maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But through what people are talking in the background, you realize that they're not rejoicing. worried about what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And set this scene like a movie script. Describe or list the things that the player, everything that the player can see or hear that helps tell the story. Perhaps it's a dark tavern by, some fantasy city by the sea. Perhaps the wooden tables are scored and scarred. Perhaps it's dark and smoky and smelly. Maybe there's broken glass. Maybe there's teeth on the entrance. Put things in that help tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe the player needs to, they need to know that they're the one that they've been spoken about.
Exactly.
And have that tension of possibly being revealed and have repercussions coming to them as well because of the fear that the other people have.
Okay. No one ever speaks to the player directly.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.